Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Drinker Brews, the channel where I talk about revised 40, old school, pre modern, and other formats. It is March 2023, and I'm here to tell you about my performance in the February Facebook Revised League, where I managed to become champion with a red green beats deck. And I had a near perfect run with 5-0, 10-0 in the pod play, and then a 4 game finals that I barely eked out. As I talk through this, I don't want to butter myself up too much, and I don't want to speak negatively about any of my opponents. Everybody that I played against played really well and had great decks. I don't mean any offense to them when I describe how things went, and I don't mean to say that I'm some kind of genius either. It was a lot of fun to play the league, and I was happy with my deck choice and how things worked out for me. Let me give some context to the event itself. It is a small group of people that plays on Facebook over webcam, and many months there is an optional challenge for deck building. And because of February 14th being Valentine's Day, players were challenged to build a deck with 14 lands, no greater, no fewer. So I was thinking of decks that already existed that could play 14 lands and get away with it, including mono red Atog or mono blue Merfolk aggro, mono white aggro, or mono black rack with its dark rituals. Then I thought of some space that is available with the challenge in mind, um, such as Armageddon, Stone Rain, Psychic Venom, or Phantasmal Terrain, and disrupt the already shaky mana bases. With that in mind, I knew that I wanted to build starting off with Llanowar Elves. And so I was thinking what would be the best turn 2/3 drop to play off of Llanowar Elves, and I was left between Serendib Efreet and Granite Gargoyle. And kind of arbitrarily, I chose to build around Granite Gargoyle over Serendib Efreet. And I was pleased with how things worked. Here is the deck that I had. Look at this poor thing with its 41st card. The last video that I made was talking about how to build decks with a higher consistency and chances to win. And then right after that, I submitted a 41 card deck in the league, and I am ashamed. But I played my first match and then realized my error later while talking with a buddy about what was in the deck. And next time, I'll do better. But we have a curve out deck, hoping to play a turn 1 Curd Ape or Llanowar Elves. We have a turn 2 Granite Gargoyle play. I was very impressed with how well Giant Spiders worked out this league. A Giant Spider took down a Singular Vampire, and Giant Spiders helped me stabilize against aggressive decks that brought me to the end game where I was able to take advantage of my X spells. Basically, the plan is run out some creatures early and play Giant Growth to deal 5 damage at a time with Curd Ape or Granite Gargoyle and a Giant Growth, and finish out the game with burn spells. I can regrowth the burn spells, Lightning Bolt, Fireball, and Disintegrate included. And that's basically how everything went. And what this deck does not have includes a greater number of fireballs or disintegrates. And the reason for that, well, there are different reasons for this. For one thing, the Fallen Empires 40 League is playing around with this idea of restricting cards to 2 copies instead of 1 or banning them outright. And so I was wanting to test what that would look like in Revised 40. And for another thing, over the past 3 years, various people have proposed that Fireball be upgraded to uncommon. And so if you count the Curd Apes, the Regrowth, Soul Ring, and Lightning Bolts, I have 8 uncommons. And so I was wanting to see what it was like to play Fireball as an uncommon and as a 2 of, because those are ideas that people have floated around. Other things that this deck are missing are Channel and Wheel of Fortune. And so, as for that, other than making room for the fireballs as my uncommons, or making room for Granite Gargoyle, which was the main play I wanted to do after Llanowar Elves, and having consistent access to mana with the Taigas. Um, so there are different arguments for why these cards are excluded, but one thing is that ever since June 2020, when I saw a list by Lucas Baum in the Raging Bull event, I wanted to try out No Channel and No Wheel. So Raging Bull was an event that is Swedish old school. And when I think of that format, I'm thinking the deck or Lion de Bolt or um, I guess those two, mainly Disco Troll, as being primary candidates to win a Swedish event. And Lucas Baum instead won it with Red Green Beats, which raised a lot of eyebrows, and a lot of people were very curious about it. He goes on to a podcast and explains to Mono, for All Things Considered, that he omitted Wheel and he omitted Channel, among other cards, because he wanted all of his top decks to be live and relevant consistently. So ever since then, I was thinking, okay, yeah, sometimes when I draw Channel, it's a dead card, or sometimes I'm stuck with it in hand and don't have an X spell to go with it. Or sometimes if I play Wheel of Fortune, it might benefit my opponent more than it benefits me. So let's just keep to all business. And so I have all creatures, direct damage, mana, or pump spells. And in a sense, the giant growth are direct damage as well. They're like bolts, 4 through 8. Um, so that's the kind of competitive reason for the omission of Channel and Wheel. And then I guess the casual or gentleman's agreement reason is to try Fireball out as a 2 of and as an uncommon. I don't have any particular opinion or passionate stance on whether Fireball rules need to be changed for Revised 40. I don't think that it would make a difference, but I can save that for people that are in charge to decide. So anyway, there's the deck. I do think that it should be cut down to 40 cards, and with that, all draws are live. Reasoning in play, I think I would cut a giant growth, because sometimes an opponent has stabilized and you don't have any creatures to pump with it. So that would be the 41st card and the first that I would cut. If you were going to include a channel, you could drop a Llanowar Elves or two. And if you're going to include a wheel, I guess I would take out a Granite Gargoyle for it rather than a Taiga as your 5th rare. And then, out of curiosity, I looked through the league to see when it was relevant that I had a taiga instead of another basic land, forest, or mountain. And I think that if you're on a budget, the taigas dropped for 1 forest and 1 mountain would be mostly inconsequential. There was one game where it mattered that I had taiga instead of another forest or mountain. And so it might come up, but it might also be no problem for you to make that swap. And that would make this a very cheap deck to play and a lot of fun too. Looking at the matchups, the first match was against 4-color Armageddon. The match against the Armageddon player, sometimes he didn't have access to the mana that he needed. And I was able to just get away from him before Armageddon came down to affect my mana base. There was one time where I was looking at a giant spider in my hand. I had a chance to pump and attack with Llanowar Elves, or I could tap the Llanowar Elves down to play giant spider. I was wondering if my opponent was going to be playing Armageddon, and I played the giant spider thinking it might be my last chance, and indeed it was. The opponent did Armageddon, but I had a good board presence by that point. Then I played 2-color Armageddon, just 2 colors, as they say. Unfortunately for my opponent, one game he had all green mana and white spells, and the next game he had all green spells and white mana. So that was a very quick match, and Kurt Apes and Granite Gargoyles got out from under him before he was able to do much. Better luck next time. Then I played against Mono Black Aggro. This was the only non-Stone Rain or Armageddon deck that I played against. There was one interesting moment in the game where I attacked with a Llanowar Elves and a Giant Spider and a Curd Ape into a Singular Vampire. I think he might have been better to block the Llanowar Elves. That way, if I play a Giant Growth, he's taking 2 cards, the Llanowar Elves and the Giant Growth, for his Vampire. Instead, as it was, since I Giant Growth the Curd Ape, I was able to take down a Singular Vampire with that 1 card Giant Growth. So that's something to be aware of if you're playing against a red-green beats deck. Try to make your blocks where they're slightly less unfavorable for you. Then I played against Stone Rain for 2 matches, and the Stone Rain deck in match 4, I think, got me down to 0 permanents a couple times. Unfortunately, my opponent wasn't able to follow up with any pressure to close out the game. Maybe Juggernauts or having simply drawn his Shivan Dragon could have wrapped things up for him and made things fall his way. As it was, I was able to trickle in a little more mana as I drew them and rebuild my board presence. Then in match 5, I think the only interesting thing to go back and look at if we were able to watch the match would be to see if my opponent would have been able to beat me before I beat him had he simply targeted me with his X spells instead of my creatures. It was a concern that he had during the match. But those things are so hard to know because a Curd Ape can win in 4 turns if it's Giant Growth each time. And X spells can take that long or more to draw and develop your mana and play enough to beat the opponent. So it's tough to say. But then, so after this, legendary for me, 5-0, 10-0 run, I made it into the finals where I faced against a mono white aggro deck. I think that mono white aggro was a very good call for the event because it operates without much mana. And so whether you don't draw many of your 14 lands or whether the opponent is disrupting your mana base, mono white aggro should be able to function with Benalish Heroes and an Anthem effect in play. I mulliganed to 5 in game 1 and knew very quickly that my undefeated run was going to be over. I was overwhelmed and lost. I feel like I did get close and was able to play a Giant Spider and block a little bit, but I'd already lost so many cards. Giant Growthing my creatures to take out one single banding creature, and my opponent distributed the damage because of banding in such a way that made it very difficult to trade with him or get his board presence down. But then game 2, I burned out his threats and came in with larger creatures and won. Game 3 had a heroic moment where my opponent played an eye for an eye on my Disintegrate that was going to win the game. Instead, it became a draw, and so we went to game 3 where opponent was on the play once again. And this time we had quite a grind with lots of burn spells and lots of trades where finally, I think what I talked about in my last video, where I was able to take advantage of the cards that I drew in the end game, particularly the X spells and the regrowth and giant spiders. And my opponent didn't have as many active or live draws in that time. So I think the decks suffer without having reach or some sort of end game plan. Where usually he didn't have to worry about that, but it happened to work out my way that one match. But all my opponents were great. I love spending time with all these guys, and I thank them for their games and look forward to the next time we get to play. None of this imagery is mine. I appreciate Wizards for having made this stuff a long time ago. If you have any feedback, please let me know in the comments. And I'm on Instagram as well, revised40. Please check the links in the description for this video, where you can find a link to Discord and the podcast where Lucas Baum, I hope I'm saying that right, describes his tournament performance at Raging Bull with Mono from All Things Considered. Thank you all. See you next time.